The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Hello and welcome along to The Profile with me, Justin Brierley, bringing you another story of a Christian in all kinds of walks of faith and life. And today, it's a great pleasure to be joined by Adrian Plass. Before we get talking to Adrian, let me remind you that The Profile is brought to you in association with Premier Christianity magazine. And if you'd like to read more interviews with all kinds of people, then do go to our website, premierchristianity.com. You can even add /free sample to that web address, and we'll send you a free sample copy of the latest magazine if you request one. Well, here on The Profile, it's always a great pleasure to meet people that I've known through the pages of their books, and that's the case today with Adrian. Welcome along to the programme, Adrian.
Good to be here.
It's great to have you. I bumped into you, as I'm sure many, many people will have in the past, through, of course, the secret diary of Adrian Mole.
Sacred diary.
Sacred diary of Adrian Plass,
Yeah.
which was a takeoff on, of course, the Sue Townend.
It rode on the back of... She made a little more money than I did, but yes.
I mean, that was, I guess that was the late 80s that was written, was it? Or?
It was 87 it came out.
And obviously she'd had this phenomenal success.
That's right.
And then you... I mean, did you very consciously kind of obviously take up her kind of style?
No, it was a suggestion by a man called Andy Butcher, who was the deputy editor of Family magazine, which later had many changes of name. But he said, why don't you do a column called The Secret Diary of Adrian Plass? And so that began, and it was hugely successful, to my surprise. And that expanded into a book. So that's how it began. And I was just recovering from an illness, so it was an opportunity to vent my spleen in a humorous way.
Were you surprised at the success that the Sacred Diary had?
Staggered, absolutely stunned. I remember going to Spring Harvest in those very early days, and they said, "Will you come over and sign some books?" And I thought, well, I don't want to line myself up for total humiliation. But I went, sat at this little table, kept my head down, and hoped I could soon leave. And this hush fell, and I looked up, and they were all holding my book. And I signed books for 2.5 hours, and I went back to the chalet where I was with my wife. And I said, I think something's changed in our lives. I'm not quite sure what it is.
I think what changed was that you, in that book, obviously a slightly fictional account, but sort of based, I think, in the kind of reality that most people experience Christian life in, which is that it's a bit absurd sometimes and a bit silly, and we're not all these spiritual heroes.
No, none of us are spiritual heroes.
and I think people just resonate with that, because that's the reality of what most people experience.
It is true. We have a corporate expression of faith, which sounds fairly ordered and well-shaped. But I remember being at Lee Abbey recently and saying to a group of people, after I'd been with them for a week, I get the feeling for most of you, God's input into your lives has been patchy at most over the years. No word of argument with that. Now, that isn't to say that isn't an insult to God. It's a reflection on the way faith is taught and the way in which the reception of faith is taught. But I think we've got to embrace those problems and honour God. People are always using that phrase to me, well, you can go and honour God in your own way. I want to honour God by talking about the way things actually happen, not how they ought to happen.
You're an author, a speaker. You have been involved in running a Christian retreat centre as well. We're going to be talking about your latest book, The Shadow Doctor.
Yeah.
Just take us back, though, to Adrian Plass as a young man. Were you born into a Christian family?
Actually, I was born into a family where the Irish troubles were reflected fairly strongly. My father was a Catholic. My mother was a kind of low church Protestant.
And did that bring some troubles?
Oh, yes. No, we had our own little version of the troubles weekly, really.
Right.
I remember thinking, God isn't capable of handling this household, let alone the rest of the world. That was a really odd beginning. And
did that put you off religion?
It was in Latin.
Oh, right.
It was an hour of Latin, and there was nothing wrong with it, I suppose, but it was boring.
Right.
And then when I was 16, I went to an Anglican youth club looking for girls, I have to say.
Looking for girls, not God.
No, absolutely not for God. And there were girls there. They had these oddly predatory smiles on their faces. Obviously, they were praying for me. If I'd known that, I'd have run a mile. But through going there, I kind of got interested, and an evangelist came. And did you know evangelist is an anagram of silage bent? That is a stunning thought.
I didn't know that.
No,
but now that you pointed out,
do.
I'm surprised I've never thought
absolutely,
of it that way.
Yeah. But he was talking about how the thief on the cross, as we all know, asked Jesus to remember him. And Jesus didn't say, well, it depends on your quiet time or your prayer life or whether you're good or whether you're bad or which church you go to. He just said yes. And I think that instinct to provide people with yes, not in solving problems, but in being yes for them, has stayed with us, certainly with my wife and I, all these years. And it's still what we do. We pray with people a lot. We haven't got easy answers, but we have got us, and we are us, and we say yes to people about their lives. And I think it's really important.
Yeah. That's taken you through various forms of ministry and getting involved with churches. I mean, eventually that led you to the Scargill House community, didn't it?
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that period in your life.
It was interesting. I mean, people talk about guidance an awful lot. I don't think it happens a great deal, to be absolutely honest. But on this occasion, we sat in our kitchen in Sussex and we said to God, it was in 2008, I think. So we'll go anywhere and do anything. We didn't mean it, of course. You never mean it. The reservations abound. But
just don't actually answer this.
Don't actually, yeah. But we sort of meant it. And I tell you what we did do. We said, we'll cancel all our engagements in 2010. We won't accept any invitations. It's your year.
Wow.
And felt a little insecure after that. And after that, we heard Scargill had closed in 2008. And from then on, all I can say is that from then on, I knew we were going to Scargill. We were going to Scargill. That's where we're going. We're going to Scargill. And it was a new council bought it, and I asked if I could be writer in residence there, and they said yes. And it opened early in 2010. So our year that we had offered was taken. If we hadn't done that, we'd have missed 4 or 5 of the most productive and fascinating years we've ever known.
Yeah.
So, I mean, not everybody can do that.
No.
But I would recommend people give some proper time, empty some proper time to hear what's going on.
And I suppose it was a lesson in learning to live in a community, which...
Oh, good heavens, yes. I tell you, the history of communities, when it's written, is just full of lies. It is hell inhabited by God. That is all I can say. We went through some terrible times in those early days, and we were with people we loved.
Yeah.
Well, my goodness knows what it would be like to be with people we hated. But I think because it grew like a tree, we didn't set out and say it will be like this, and this. We said it won't be like this, and this, which I think was very helpful. Yeah. And actually now it's running really well. We're not associated with it very much now, still technically community members. But it's kind of ragged at the edges, which Christian living needs to be, I think, to allow the shape to form that God has in mind and not the one that we do. And we pay lip service to that, but doing it's tricky.
It is. It requires determination, commitment, and organisation, I'm sure. But at the same time, like you say, Christian life, I guess it's a shame when it becomes a little bit too pristine or polished. It sounds like you're more interested in the ragged edge of Christianity in that way.
I just think, I mean, I know this is kind of hackneyed, but I don't know what's going on anymore. I really don't. I mean, God is God, right? He does what he likes.
Yeah.
And like Paul, when he was in prison with Silas, you know, if he'd had a prayer group working for him and he'd kind of tweeted them and said, "This is what's happening," they'd have said, "Well, where did you go wrong, Paul? What have you done that's caused it?" Your life happens. If you want God in it, let him in it. wait and see what happens, and get excited if you like, or bored, which you do, but don't try and make it happen.
Right.
And a lot of organizations have failed because they move on. There's a bit in the New Testament, I can't remember where it talks about people, I can't remember what it's going beyond or something, going too far.
Yeah.
You probably know, I can't remember. But that is what happens. You never know what's going to happen next. And you have to have good organization, but after that...
Yeah.
Oh.
You're someone who likes to tell funny stories.
Yes.
Do you think the church has too often been a bit too humourless in the way it's put things across?
I think it's to do with permission, really. I think that there is a dimension of neurosis about whether God exists or not in the church. And because of that fear, we worship the scaffolding very often. And what we need to do is to devise something that when the scaffolding goes down, there's something that the house of love and peace and joy is inside. But if you keep decorating the scaffolding too much through insecurity, but I think laughter is a great help. I'll tell you quickly, a lady phoned me, and I don't know where she got my number, but she phoned me and said, I phoned you because I've committed the sin against the Holy Spirit. And
the unforgivable sin.
Yeah, the unforgivable sin.
Right.
So I said, oh, well, congratulations. That's amazing. So there's a pause while she tried to digest this. And she said, what is the sin against the Holy Spirit? So I said, well, I can help you there. I know exactly what it is. It's scrumping, stealing apples. Said that is the one that the Holy Spirit hates most. There was another long pause, and she fell about laughing. She hadn't committed any sin against. She just wants to be loved.
Yeah. And
somewhere at the heart of that question was, she was saying, as many people say to us in times when we pray with them, does God love me? That is the perennial problem. When will I meet him? When will he be the thing that people have promised me for so long? And I don't shy away from that anymore. I used to have all sorts of clever answers for it. I haven't anymore.
In that sense, would you say your Christian faith has become more simple as you've gone on? Or more complicated? Or a bit of both?
Well, both, really. Yeah. I mean, simple in the sense that I don't understand anything anymore. And in the sense that, as I was saying to someone earlier today, that the mystery is not dark. It's got a, like when Solomon built the temple and the shadows, all the lights went out, and Solomon said, God has told me he'll be in the cloud. There's something in the cloud that is really valuable, and that kind of put your hand out in the dark and you can just about feel it taken. So it is simple, it is complicated, whatever anyone says. I meet people for whom it's not, and I think they're wonderful, people who help others and love God and don't have any problems, and that's great, but it's not me.
Yeah. How much of you is in your new book, The Shadow Doctor, would you say?
Well, not as much as the actual character in there. The Shadow Doctor himself is, I suppose, a kind of point I'd like to be at, where I can not use Christian language in the way that we usually do, but I can go with the flow of the Spirit. Not in the sense that I think the main thing in this book, perhaps I'm trying to say, which I've only just realised, is that you don't need to role play anything about being a Christian,
right?
Either verbally or in behaviour. You don't need to role play it. You have to sometimes control your urges. That's another thing, or put your prejudices in a box. But yeah, the main character is struggling to meet the flow of the Spirit of God and help people through that.
Right.
That's not quite as simple as it sounds.
Well, just tell me why. I believe you actually had the title of this book in your head before you ever put a word down about it. That's not the normal way that these things happen, is it?
It's embarrassing, isn't it? I once wrote a book called An Alien at St. Wilfrid's. I met a man in a pub who looked a bit like an alien. and he went to a church called St Wilfrid's.
and that was the genesis of the
book.
book.
The title. Yeah, it really was. I went home and I said to Bridget, I'm going to write a book called An Alien at St Wilfrid's. And she said, what's it about? And I said, I don't know. But this was similar, except that I thought it would be fascinating to have a man who was trying to help people with their shadows. Well, that's something we try to do.
Shadows being the things from the past, the baggage.
Things that are afflicting people. And most of the ones in this book are things that have actually happened to people we know, and I've very carefully asked their permission. There's a lady in there who is frightened that she will explode, for instance.
Right.
And normally when people come for ministry, they don't say things like that.
That's not the usual pastoral problem.
No, thank God, when they talk to us, they tell the truth. And so that particular problem really intrigued me. And I won't tell you what she meant by it. You can read it in the book.
Right.
But just going into these situations, saying, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what I'll say. I don't know how I'll deal with it, but I'm going to. So, yeah, I only had the title. But as I wrote the book, I began to realize what it was about, which is a bit strange, really. But it began to grow on me.
It sounds like serious subject matter, but it's also very funny.
I think there are some funny things in it, yes.
How do you do that? How do you kind of take something that's
well, I think they're very much very close together, aren't they? Again, it's a hackneyed thing to say, but humour and laughter and tears. We often call our evenings laughter and tears because laughter opens some kind of door in people that allows them to cry sometimes.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I don't think I can't not be humorous.
Yeah.
And I can't not be concerned about the darker things. There's one line I like in there where the young man Jack says, "You watch those late night religious programs," and the shadow doctor says, "No, I try to avoid pornography," which you can interpret in any way you like.
Yes.
But I think some people will know exactly what that means.
Yes.
So
that's interesting.
Through shorthand, sometimes you can say something you feel very, very deeply. But it's serious.
Yeah, it is. It is. Just in terms of what people you're hoping will get from this, do you feel like people have the opportunity to, in some way, express that part of themselves to people in the way that they're able to talk to the shadow doctor in this book?
What I hope is that they feel a sense of freedom. That when people go for prayer or they go for ministry or whatever you want to call it, they often assemble it before they go in a way that means it will conform to the models that they've been used to. I hope if they read this, they might think, I really want to talk about the thing that is really hurting me, the thing that sounds so pathetic or so anti-Christian or whatever, that if I say it, I'll be condemned before I start or I'll be rejected. So I hope that will happen because there's a real need for it. And once you've done it, it's amazing. It's fine.
Yeah.
Depending on who hears it.
Yeah.
So obviously you don't want to, the Bible says, don't cast your pearls before swine. And your problems are pearls. I mean, they've accreted around irritation and difficulty. And those pearls are very valuable to God. So when you give them to God and you say, I don't know, whatever you are, whatever you've done, especially whatever you've done, men especially, men are often harbouring memories of terrible things they've done or they feel they've done, and really deep down can't believe God is going to forgive them.
So in some ways it's about being honest with God and with yourself.
So. Yeah.
And I suppose dropping some of the masks and the things that we tend to use to kind of maybe give a picture of ourselves, try and persuade ourselves that we're a particular kind of person.
I think so. Like I said, role-playing is really a waste of time because you are what you are. And we've often said to people, God is not looking for wonderful Christians, he's looking for obedient pillocks. You need, what he wants is people who will say, I'm imperfect, I'm lacking in many ways, but I will go. If you ask me to go, I'll go.
Yeah.
and you are going to have to look after me because I'm weak and I'll probably fail at certain points. And I think then the response of God is, that's fine. Let's do some stuff.
Yeah. At what level do you think of, I don't know whether the shadow doctrine in any way represents the kind of thing Jesus was doing in the way he, I guess, spoke to people, and very often went directly to the issue. You know, the rich young man says, comes to him and says, I've kept all the commandments.
Yes,
what must
right.
I now do to have eternal life? And he pinpoints the problem.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether at what level is Jesus represented in the book?
I think he and the shadow doctrine is obviously on the way to that, but he's not secure enough in himself to feel he is that wonderful in doing it. But he's begun to experience it.
Yeah.
But I think the way he puts it at one point is that when you listen to people, it's like coming to a roundabout and there are 4 or 5 exits. And you notice one tiny little one with a little sign on it, scribbled on it, and you think, yeah, that's the one. That's the one. So a lot of it's about really genuinely listening, as Jesus obviously did, and then coming out with these cataclysmic comments to people, like the woman at the well. You know, yes, you're too right. You married 5 times.
Yeah.
Breaking right into them, but without destroying them, without hurting them, but in such a way that they think, here is somebody who really sees into me and wants to help. Yeah.
I mean, in a sense, it's in a different way. I think this book is bringing out the thing you began with the diary, the Sacred Diary of Adrian Plass, which is to say, let's break down some of the barriers we build and some of the silly things, and let's not necessarily take ourselves too seriously at the same time. Let's be honest about who we are and our failures and everything else. Do you feel the church generally is getting better at that? Because I think there has been this problem with the church of saying, now you're inside, now you're a Christian, you have to be this victorious, overcoming individual with the perfect family, smiley face, who will draw lots of other people because it all looks so attractive. And the reality is, a lot of people feel like, I don't feel like they end up feeling like I'm a failure because that I'm not living up to this sort of ideal.
I think that is true, and I like I was saying just now, I mean, I know God isn't looking for wonderful Christians. He's looking for people who will be obedient. Obedience is one of the major imperatives in the New Testament, if you want to talk in those terms.
Well, he had a few obedient pillocks who followed him, didn't he?
He did. Yes, he absolutely did. I don't know if the church is better at that than they were.
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right, though. It's the sacred diary with different clothes on, really. But it's an attempt on my part to rehabilitate God. I mean, I'm sure he's thrilled that I'm going to do that. But to say to people, look, don't give up. Don't stop searching. Go on looking for God. Try to trust him. Stop playing Fisher-Price Christian things, and open your mind and your heart when you're with people and give yourself to them and see what happens.
Do you think a non-Christian could get something out of this book, Adrian?
Oh, who knows? I don't know. I think some of the stories are probably they would. I mean, there's a story about a man who's being blackmailed, and he has the sword. So there's no specifically religious component to that story. Yeah. But it's a problem that he deals with. And in fact, afterwards, his new colleague Jack says, but was God in that or not? Or is there any God in that? And he can't really answer it because it's part of the flow. Yeah. So I think it is, as the chap who wrote the commendation on the front said, I think it is an engaging...
William Paul Young.
Yeah, it is.
Author of The Shack.
It is an engaging book. I think it's the sort of book that you'd start and you think, I think I'd quite like to know what happens next.
Yeah. Great. Can we expect to see a sequel at some point?
You jolly well can.
Good.
Yes, I've got several ideas, and I've left several mysteries unsolved at the end, which I've really got a soul in the second one.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we look forward to that. It's available now. Hodder and Stoughton, The Shadow Doctor by Adrian Plass. Sounds like some excellent reading. And I hope that, I hope you'll come back and tell us about the next part. And
I'd love to.
Thank you for continuing to produce books that will help normal Christians.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. Thank you, Justin.
It's great to have you on The Profile today. I've been Justin Brierley. My guest has been Adrian Plass. And if you want to listen back to this interview, you can go to our website, premierchristianradio.com/The Profile. And don't forget that Premier Christianity magazine, the monthly edition of the magazine, brings you brilliant interviews with people like Adrian and many other people besides. Want to find out more? premierchristianity.com.
The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Where faith comes to life.
Welcome back to the second half of this week's Profile. A great pleasure to be joined for this half of the programme by Malcolm Guite. He's a poet, theologian and songwriter. He's also chaplain of Girton College in Cambridge. And just a reminder that The Profile is brought to you in association with Premier Christianity magazine. If you want to read more interviews with all kinds of interesting people, do go to our website, premierchristianity.com, and you can ask for a free sample copy of the latest magazine there. I'm Justin Brierley, the senior editor of the magazine, joined by Malcolm Guite in this section of the programme. Malcolm, thank you for joining me.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
I've been really looking forward to speaking to you because I've seen you on stages and on Twitter and read some of your poetry as well. So it's lovely to have you here in person to talk about your life and faith journey. We always go back to the beginning on The Profile. So tell us a little bit about growing up, because you actually were born and raised for at least part of your life in Africa, weren't you?
Yes, that's right. I was born in Ibadan in Nigeria. Back in 1957, actually, the last years in which Nigeria was still at that time a crown colony. It was just making its transition. My dad was a lecturer in classics, in Greek and Latin, but also a Methodist local preacher, very strongly involved with the local church and ecumenically. And I grew up there and till I was 7, and then had another 3 years in Zimbabwe, or as it was then. It was Rhodesia at that time. And all that time in Africa, which I, loved as a child, I don't have long, coherent memories, but I've isolated, vivid glimpses of what it was like. I loved thunderstorms, and I used to be asked to be allowed to run out and dance in the rain. As
The
it
best
came
thunderstorms
bucketing
I've ever experienced have also been in Africa.
Yeah. But every year, my dad, on leave, came back to England, to universities, to do some work either in Manchester or Cambridge, and he would fly back, but my mother wouldn't fly, so we used to go back by sea. And I have long and lovely memories of these long voyages. A couple of weeks out at sea on the way back, and then a couple of weeks again the other way.
A lot of time for reading and finding ways to amuse yourself. But in many ways, I believe that ties into the other aspect of what we're going to be talking about today, which is your latest book, Mariner, A Voyage with Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It's a book in which you explore the famous rhyme of the ancient mariner. And the life of the person who wrote it, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. We'll come to all that later, but I believe it was actually on those sea journeys that your first recollections of being delivered poetry by your mother.
I love being on board ship, as we said, but my mother, who had been in the Wrens actually in the war and was just a natural seafaring woman, was also a great lover of poetry and had a sort of inexhaustible fund of wonderful poetry. She'd whatever you saw, if you saw another ship on the horizon, she had a poem about that, and all the John Masefield things. I must go down to the sea again, but she would often recite verses from it. So we'd be out at sea and the breeze blowing, and she'd go, "The fair breeze blew, the white foam flew, the furrow followed free," So I first heard that sense that language lifts into something special and magical from my mother, and I've always felt that way about poetry.
And in that sense, the best kind of introduction to poetry, which wasn't sort of very forced
Exactly
chore
so,
in an English lesson. It was something fun
Yes.
and
Poetry
exciting.
was always playtime for me, not work. Yeah.
So this was where your passion for poetry and literature and so on began. How did that go alongside your own faith? You were born obviously in a Christian family, had that sort of upbringing, but I believe things sort of faded away.
Yes,
over time.
I mean, some people are fortunate that they're able to be, that sort of anima naturalita Christiana. They just it goes with them automatically, and they grow through it. And I think that's a blessing. I don't think there's any special premium on having either fallen away or had a conversion, but such it was for me. Faith was nurtured at home, but very gently. But I left home. I was sent away to school, to boarding school, when I was in my early teens. My dad was in Canada at that point and wanted me to have my sort of British education and sense of British identity. Academically, I'm very grateful for that. It was a superb experience in that respect, but it was also very traumatic and lonely, and I didn't like being a boarder, and it was a dark time for me in some ways. I think I probably had a fairly stormy adolescence anyway. And in the midst of all of that, I didn't so much let go of my faith as positively throw it overboard. And I tried really to believe for a long time that there was no ultimate truth, no transcendent meaning, no point or purpose in anything, that really everything in the universe had just sort of happened accidentally, and that all the things we valued about being and consciousness were just a kind of accident.
An
of space
illusion,
and time. Which you can maintain for a while, because that's kind of quite a cool thing to think as an adolescent. It's all grim and meaningless. But although I did jettisoned my faith, I obviously needed some sense of, you need something beautiful in your life, and for me that beautiful thing became poetry. And eventually I came to realise that the kind of experience I had in poetry, in really great poetry, I don't just mean Christian poetry, was of such a level and such a depth, and so, as it were, alive and trembling with meaning, that such a thing could not happen in a meaningless cosmos, and that meaning had to be the clue to things in the end. Also then, fortunately, when I came up to Cambridge to study literature, of course, you read everything, it's a very thorough course, and I was then exposed to really great Christian poetry. And I would utterly echo C.S. Lewis's own comment in a very similar trajectory, to compare the ridiculous with the sublime. He said, my imagination was baptized before I was, and the rest of me just took a bit longer to catch up.
I was going to say your story does reflect in so many ways the same one that Lewis had.
Well, of course, Lewis was a companion in that story.
Yeah.
I mean, I read the Narnia books as a child, utterly loved them. And then, they were still in my mind, even in my kind of atheist and then agnostic days. But of course, in a sense, for me, poetry was the new religion for a while. Yeah. And who should crop up as, say, for example, the best expositor of Milton, whom I now love, because I read C.S. Lewis's preface to Paradise Lost. So he became a kind of companion and guide to me as much literally
what's
as
not
theologically.
So well known about Lewis is that he also tried his hand at poetry himself.
Yes, he did.
Was able to put together some quite good verse himself.
Some very good verse. In fact, I think unjustly neglected verse.
Right.
So it was when I was asked to contribute to the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis, I took great pleasure in writing the chapter on Lewis as a poet, and saying I think he's really worth reading.
Of course, he's remembered in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. What about your own then journey as a poet? Was that something that you were trying from early on? Is that something that grew up as you came to appreciate the poetry?
I think
you were
it was
reading?
something that I had in me early on, in the sense that I got it from my mother, and my mother would recite things and I would recite them, and certain poems she recited stayed with me, and I think influenced me both poetically and in a way spiritually. I mean, just as an instance, again, this was to do with being out at sea and the sun setting at sea. My mother used to recite. My mother was brought up in a very Presbyterian, Scots, Calvinist Presbyterian household. But she was full of this poetry, which was alive with much more universal imagery. Yeah. So I remember the sun setting at sea, whenever it did, if we were up on deck, ritually, my mother would go, out beyond the sunset, could I but find the way, is a sleepy blue laguna that widens to a bay. And there's the blessed city, or so the sailors say, the golden city of St. Mary. you know. And that just, it was beautiful. And it was like, you see this light and there's something beyond this light and there is a city there. And that's what I'm yearning for. You know, I'll be shipping sunsetwards and westward home.
So there you are as a student.
Yeah.
You're enthralled with poetry. Now, I don't know, this was in the 60s, 70s that we're talking
70s,
about. I mean, most people of your era would have been listening to, you know, Led Zeppelin and that sort of thing. I mean, were you a sort of bit of an oddity with your your poetry?
Well, I have to say I listened to Led Zeppelin as well. Although naturally, of course, what I really listened to was Bob Dylan and Leonard Cohen.
Yeah.
So I was a complete...
Poets themselves.
You know, I listened to Dylan and Cohen and Van Morrison. So all that music was there. And when I really started to try writing poetry myself properly, which was really as a sort of in my late teens, and then as an undergraduate, I began and had a burst of it. And it was kind of, you know, Bob Dylan meets John Keats on a bad night, you know. It was sort of a bit all over the place and very luxurious and gushy, but, you know.
But you've got to start somewhere.
You've got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
I remember later I'm very, very fond of and indebted to the late, great Irish poet Seamus Heaney. And he's got a wonderful, you know, line to ardent adolescent poems, and he says, "Don't let the veins bulge on your biro." And that's kind of, you know, you can overdo it, but you know, you have to learn actually that there's a beauty in restraint, that you can gesture towards something that's larger than the line itself. So there's learning the craft, and I became fascinated by the craft. I was a bit of a rebel from that point of view because, of course, in the 70s and then later in the official, if you like, high culture art poetry world, it was all about free form. Nobody rhymed, and it was all about almost willful obscurity, and it was also pretty secular. So by the time I finally got into my stride and I'd become a Christian again in my final year as an undergraduate, I was like writing, A, my poetry had faith, you know, B, it rhymed and had meter, you know, and C, it was lucid. So it's like,
basically, you were doing everything everyone else wasn't.
Three strikes and you're out, you know. But I persisted with it.
And at what point did a call to ministry, ordination, and so on go along with that?
Well, in a way, I also kind of have a poet to thank for that, in that after I graduated, I was an English teacher for a while, and I always saw myself as, you know, not quite fitting in and a bit of a rebel, and had long hair and all of that.
Still have.
And, you know, I didn't, insofar as I had any idea of what a vicar was supposed to be, I was probably still haunted by that sort of, you know, have some tea vicar and the sort of kind of Derek Nimmo curate. So I didn't think I fitted. But I was, as well as teaching, I was doing a part-time PhD, and I did it on a poet who also became a Dean of St. Paul's and a great preacher, whom I deeply admired, John Donne, at once a great love poet and a great religious poet. And as I was working on Donne, I realised this guy was ordained in the Church of England. You know, like, there was room in the Church of England. I mean, admittedly, it was in the 17th century. But, you know, there was room in the Church of England for a guy like this. And I began to feel more and more that maybe I had this calling, and I wasn't quite sure, and I tested it. But in the end... And the other person, of course, who came into the frame for me by then was another priest poet, George Herbert.
Yes.
Another long hair, lute playing, you know. So those guys actually, to some degree, helped me to believe, to trust that the calling might be a real calling.
You can be a poet and a pastor in one. Interesting stuff. Thank you so much. I'm talking to Malcolm Guite on today's edition of The Profile. Just a reminder that this programme brought to you in association with Premier Christianity magazine. I'm Justin Brierley, the senior editor of the mag. Malcolm, you've written a book called Mariner, A Voyage with Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It's the kind of book that would do serious damage if it was dropped on anyone's head from a large height. This is a substantial volume. I guess
it's a labour of love. You know?
It is. So in a sense, this poem that was one of your earliest memories out at sea has obviously developed into this very full-blooded look at the life of Coleridge, and just unpacking, hopefully in not the way that the hated English teachers used to unpack poetry.
The book being dropped from a great height. You know, I think poets are not served by being dropped from a great height on top of the unwilling heads of, you know, trembling students. I think this poetry is much better as a series of illicit discoveries than it is as
And
a
I suppose
kind of duties.
you'd rather your book make someone go and read The Mariner again
absolutely.
than anything.
I want them to read the poem, and actually there's almost all of the poem is in the book by the time, because I just quote so much of it. But I think it might be quite useful to have
Just for those who aren't necessarily familiar with the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, just give us a little background to it. What's the basic outline of the poem?
So this started off... Coleridge and Wordsworth were friends in Somerset that went off for a walk, and they had the idea that they'd write a quick sort of schlock horror gothic ballad and sell it to a magazine.
This is in the late 1700s.
This is in the late 17... This is 1797.
Yeah.
They thought they might get a fiver from a sort of, local magazine, and they sort of tossed this poem off quickly, a bit of a throwaway, and pay for the walking tour that they wanted, with that. But once they started it, Coleridge really got hold of it and realised, wait, there's more here. But the story is a wonderful story which draws on lots of old stories that Coleridge had read in, sea captains' accounts. And, of course, he was a young man at one point in Bristol, probably heard these stories. It's got sort of bits of the Flying Scots and everything. Basically, the story is about a sailor who goes off on a voyage. We're never told what for. And... they get driven, they go right down to the equator, and then they get driven into the South Seas. They get right in the South Atlantic. They get lost in the ice. There's absolutely nothing living. They're all about to freeze to death and be enclosed by the ice. Suddenly this albatross appears. Mystically, magically, this beautiful bird sails around the mast, and they love it, and they feed it, and they hail it as if it had been a Christian soul. And then it flies towards this ice block, and the ice splits, and they steer through. And we're just going, oh, this is nice. And all this is being told to a wedding guest. And suddenly the wedding guest says, God save thee, ancient mariner, from fiends that plague thee thus. Why look'st thou so? And he says, with my crossbow I shot the albatross. And you suddenly realise, in the middle of everything going okay and fine, randomly, stupidly, for no apparent reason, he totally screws things up. Sound familiar? We do this, don't we? It's kind of complete mystery.
Yeah.
So we're never told why he did it. And eventually a series of horrific things happen. They get stuck in the doldrums. They're dying of thirst. That's where the famous water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. And then this ghost ship, this spectre ship, appears out of nowhere with only two people on board it. And one is a skeleton, which is Death himself. And the other is this really blood-chilling figure where you start off, you think, oh, this is nice, because it goes, her lips were red, her looks were free, her locks were yellow as gold. Sounds pretty good. And then it goes, her skin was white as leprosy. The nightmare life in death is she who thicks man's blood with cold. And they play dice, these two characters.
Goodness.
And death wins the crew, so they all die. And the nightmare life in death wins the mariner.
I see.
So he is now condemned to a nightmare life in death. And then you get this really weird thing where the bodies of the crew, they all curse him as they're dying. And then the bodies of the crew rise up. And he goes, oh, I'm really,
zombie style.
I'm the one guy on the zombie ship, not even the compensatory thought this is going to make a great movie franchise later.
For Johnny Depp, yes.
But, in fact, it's not the living dead. It's God's mercy, and it's a troop of angels that have come down and inspirited them. And just before this, there's a turning point where he's had the old albatross, that he shot, hung round his neck. Another phrase we have is an albatross around my neck, as a sign of his guilt. Terrible. Instead of the cross, the albatross around my neck was hung. But there comes a point where, having tried to pray and been unable to do it, wanting to repent but unable to repent, cursing everything around him. There's a terrible line which, again, people, particularly PTSD or survivor, a thousand slimy things lived on, and so did I. You just feel dreadful.
Yeah.
And then the moon rises, and the moon in the poem is this beautiful vessel of grace. And he looks out again, and for once he forgets himself. And in God's name, he blesses the other creatures. He reverses, if you like, what he did when he shot the albatross. The albatross falls off his neck, and he prays. And then rain comes. And then, as it were, this ghastly crew, he begins to get a glimmer of hope that then it's not as bad as it looks.
Right.
And they gradually sail back. And he starts to hear these two voices who are, again, like two sort of demons, who explain to him in a dream the full truth of what he did and help him to turn his life around. which is turned around through,
Yeah.
and eventually he gets back to the shore. And the extraordinary thing, which I sort of discovered as I was working on the poem in the book and trying to tell Coleridge's life. I mean, Coleridge was only 25 when he wrote it.
Yeah.
When he wrote it, everything was fine. It was good, plain sailing, as they say. But strangely, after he wrote it, things started to go wrong. And he himself went through
Very similar
stupid
experiences.
actions, tragic loss, guilt, dealing with the nightmare of addiction, family breakup, a lot of stuff.
So
that
he
happens to
kind
a lot
of
of people.
wrote in, if you like, this form of a poem,
Yeah.
sort of prophetically
poem.
almost what his life
and I
would
feel
then
it's
become.
prophetic not only of his life, but it's prophetic in a sense for all of us.
Hmm.
That all of us, one way or another, on the voyage of life, quite often get into a point where we fall into a kind of state of guilt and alienation, and we need something from beyond ourselves to turn those things around. Now, Coleridge was brought up in a Christian household, and his dad was a vicar, in fact, bound to go off and have misadventures with his son of a vicar. His dad was a vicar in Ottery St Mary's in Devon, but he still had a very deeply Christian imagination at the time that he wrote the poem. But it was after and through, really, the crises that he subsequently lived that he became to much more deepen his Christian faith, and it became a very real thing for him. And he became, in my opinion, in his later writing, a great theologian.
Because the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, I've never really thought of it as Christian poetry per se.
Yeah.
But there are references, obviously,
there are
in
lots
there,
of Christian references
even if it's
in
not
it.
very
Yeah.
blatant in that
And
way.
in fact, there's a sense in which the albatross symbolically is a sort of redemptive figure.
A Christ figure.
A Christ figure. We're told later that the bird that he shot loved him.
Right.
And and some of the illustrators of it themselves, Christians, have shown that, in the great Welsh poet painter David Jones illustrated it, and he has a very Christ-like. But I'll tell you who totally got that it was a Christian poem, and maybe borrowed from Coleridge the idea that you could have a Christ figure in a least expected way, and that is C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis's wonderful little tribute to the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is patterned into The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which, of course, another phrase from the Mariner, as idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. Well, of course, Dawn Treader starts with a painted ship upon a painted
how
ocean.
clever, yeah.
Then you remember, I don't know if you know that book, but they're sailing towards a dark island, and where dreams come true, but they turn out to be nightmares. And they find, guess what? A lost mariner. And they pull him on board the ship, and then they realise they can't get out of the darkness, and they're all having their worst nightmares happening.
I remember this
And
part,
Lucy's up on the fighting top,
Yeah.
and she says, Aslan, Aslan, if ever you loved us, help us now. And then she sees this beam of light, and she looks along the beam, and she sees, at first she thinks it's a cross. You have to say, Coleridge always rhymes albatross and cross.
Right. Yeah.
Hint, hint.
Yeah.
So, and then she realises it's an albatross.
It's an albatross.
And an albatross flies down to them, and it circles 3 times round the mast, which is exactly what's in the poem, and it guides them out. But just as it's circling round the last time, Lucy says the albatross flies towards her and says, "Courage, dear heart." And she recognises it as Aslan's voice.
In a different form.
Now, in all of the Narnia chronicles, Aslan is either a lion or a lamb.
Yes.
2 deeply biblical images. But just this once, and I think it's
He's doffing his
Lewis
cap
doffing his cap to the
Coleridge.
great master Coleridge. It's an albatross.
That is such a fascinating detail that now that you mention it, I remember the part of the story in The Dawn Treader, and suddenly, it all connects.
Yeah,
Wow,
and there's lots of
amazing.
phrases. I mean, you could go right into it. There's lots of
I mean,
phrases.
it is a poem that has resonated in popular culture. I think even bands like Fleetwood Mac and Iron Maiden have used it in song lyrics and that sort of thing. Though maybe people haven't fully appreciated how it did reflect his life. That, for me, is the most interesting thing that you've drawn out here. I mean, where did that end up for? I believe he kind of became addicted to opiates.
Yeah,
that
that's
was
right.
a pretty common affliction.
He certainly lived through the nightmare phase of the poem, the nightmare life in death, if you like. And he did literally have nightmares of the sort of a kind of evil figure, clawing at his eyes and things. But it's extraordinary how similar it was. I mean, in the poem, It's the rise of the moon, and it's something beautiful and beneficent and gracious and blessing. The way moonlight allows you to reimagine or see things in a new way. It's a moonrise which actually prefaces, if you like, the moment that grace comes to the mariner. Then you get the sound of a mighty rushing wind, and you get flames of fire in the air. You know, so it's full Pentecostal spiritual thing. Now, in Coleridge's case, it's exactly the same. His absolute 0 point, perhaps not the very worst, but one of the darkest times and
Close
places
to rock bottom.
was out in Malta, where he'd gone to try and have a complete cure and mend a broken heart and deal with the addiction, and none of that was working. And he didn't sleep, but he used to watch the moonrise. And there's a wonderful note in one of his notebooks where he says, "When I see yonder moon dim glimmering through the dewy window pane, I seem to feel that it's telling me something, that it's a word of some language from beyond and from within." And then he suddenly says in the note, he says, "It is logos." Now, logos, of course, is, the Greek word for the word.
Yeah.
Enarche and hologos, in the beginning, was the word. And from there, he seems to be recovering his faith.
Right.
And in the poem, there's a bit where the mariner is so suffering, he wants to die. And he says, for 7 days and nights, he tried to die, but he couldn't. Unbelievably. I mean, this is extraordinary.
Yeah.
When Coleridge got back from Malta and still couldn't get his life together, he knew there was some hope somewhere, but he didn't know how to make it his. And he ended up taking, possibly deliberately, a kind of really bad overdose and staggered out from where he'd been staying to a pub in outside Bath called the Greyhound, and I think intended and expected to die.
Yeah.
He didn't. He struggled, and he had in that place an extraordinary conversion experience, really, a real rededication of his life to the Logos, to Christ, and he realised it had all been head knowledge; it needed to be in the heart. Later, he said it was an experience of crucifixion, death, descent into hell, and resurrection. And then he was kind of rescued. Somebody came to help him. He and a doctor called Dr. Gilman pretty much invented rehab between the two of them. Really did. They worked out, you've got to stay there, you've got to have somebody else do the doses. And he did this heroic thing. I mean, every act of recovery is both an act of grace on God's part, but also of heroism on the part of, the person who's allowing that change to happen in their lives. And he went through all of that. And in the end of the poem, the mariner is rescued by a pilot in a boat, meets a hermit, and then becomes a kind of person whose story changes lives. And if you think of the guy he stayed with as being like the pilot's boat, rescuing him when his ship went down, and you think of how he became, they used to call him the Sage of Highgate. He lived the last, sort of 15 years of his life in Highgate as a great and profound and increasingly influential guide and teacher of the young.
Extraordinary story. Thank you for sharing it with us, and thank you for sharing your story as well in the process, Malcolm. It's been really lovely to chat through it on the profile today. Just a reminder that Malcolm Guite's book Mariner, A Voyage with Samuel Taylor Coleridge is available now. And whether or not you're into poetry, I think you'll find this a fascinating account of the life and times of Samuel Taylor Coleridge and how they were reflected so presciently in his most famous work, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Available from Hodder and Stoughton. And don't forget that you can listen back to today's programme if you go online to premierchristianradio.com/the profile. For the moment, Malcolm Guite, thank you very much for joining me on today's show.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Profile with me, Justin Brierley. And again, if you want more interviews with all kinds of people in all walks of life, you can find them in Premier Christianity magazine. Go online to premierchristianity.com. Right now, time to hand over to Dave Rose with a little look back at the best bits from the past week here on Premier Christian Radio.